Good morning. I'm Mark Sox. I'm from the White House. I'm also a former network guy, so I've been down in the trenches over the years and have had a lot of interesting times doing it. Serving briefly, maybe a year and a half, up on Richard Clark's staff in the White House, and I hope to get back to the fun maybe this time next year after I've finished doing all this nice policy stuff. Thank you to University of Oregon, to Sprint, to NANOG, and to Aaron, and to all the others who put this together. It's a wonderful opportunity to come and meet people and share experiences. And part of what one of the consistent themes you're going to hear about today is information sharing and the ability to network with each other. And so this, again, is a wonderful opportunity. And for those who can stay the entire week and attend the Aaron presentations, I think that you're going to make a lot of good contacts. What I'd like to do this morning is talk a little bit about the strategy to secure cyberspace that our office put out for comment at the end of September, or mid-September. But to lead up to that, I want to set the stage as to how we got to where we are today and why cyberspace security now has reached presidential level, and President Bush himself is interested in what we're doing and is helping us move forward on a strategy not only for our country but for other countries that are connected to the internet and to other networks that are emerging. So I'm going to walk through some items, our executive order that established us, who we are and how to get in touch with us, the strategy itself, and of course the role of individuals like you in securing cyberspace. Dr. Rice, who is the National Security Advisor, recognized early on in her tenure that cyberspace security is also important. She was giving a speech at a security policy forum in March of last year and pointed out that network defense pretty much is classic. It's a deterrence mission no different than what we've been doing many years, even going back to the Cold War and such with the nuclear threats. But the thing that she really wanted to drive home was that the first step in doing cyberspace security is to recognize that we have a problem. For those of us that are in denial, that think security is a non-issue, we can never move forward. Admitting that we have a problem and then figuring out what that problem is and dealing with it is the way to make the process start. President Bush the same year also was giving a talk and he also said that look at the new threats that are coming out. The Cold War is behind us, but many small emerging countries are developing a capability very similar to what we have. Now look at the date, June 2001, several months before September 11th. Already a recognition that storm clouds were looming on the horizon. Of course, at that point, we thought that any physical threats would be remaining offshore. We were not expecting something to happen on the soil of the United States. And just last week, many of you probably participated or observed in the denial of service attacks against the root servers and the TLDs. Ari Fleischer, standing up in front of the press, his normal 12:30 right after lunchtime press conference, was asked by one of the reporters whether the president sees these denial of service attacks as a cyber terrorist act. Well, unfortunately, we were hoping that Monday night very few people actually would have done anything with this. There was some discussion on NANOG, there was some discussion on other mailing lists, and we were hoping it would die down. What wound up happening was that some reporters got wind of it. They haven't had a good cyber terrorism story in a while, so this was a good reason to publish. And by Tuesday morning, we're fielding quite a few questions on what happened. Well, Fleischer got it right. He said that there's a lot of effort working together between government and industry to secure not only the DNS system, but other systems, other components, other mechanisms of the internet. And we are working together, government-industry partnerships, to make the network a safer place. And in fact, as most of you know, there was no effect on the root servers other than just an inconvenience. Let's go back a little bit in time. In the early 1980s, 1982 to be specific, a federal judge ordered AT&T to break up. Prior to 1982, AT&T was the only big company that was out there. In 1982, the judge said, let's break this up, and in 1984, we started the divestiture took place, and we started to see lots of new companies come out. Also in the early 80s, Sprint was putting fiber optic networks across North America. Other countries were getting into the fiber world. The internet, the term internet, was starting to be used at that point. DNSs are coming alive because we realize that host tables are just growing. And throughout the 80s, very quietly, this little network is being built that someday will become what we call today's internet. Although back in those days, we didn't realize what was going on. Of course, in the late 80s, around 1990, the concept of a World Wide Web was birthed. A small company called Mosaic started building software, which became Netscape, and the rest is history. If we now come up to 1997, just a few years ago, the Pentagon has a series of exercises called Eligible Receiver. These are internal exercises where they stress or take measurements on what we're doing inside the Defense Department. And in 1997, the thrust of that Eligible Receiver exercise was to see if the Defense Department, in fact, was vulnerable when it comes to computer networks. Because we had been working on networks since the late 60s, since the birth of the ARPANET in '69, so now we're up about 30 years later. Let's take a look. So over a period of a couple of weeks, a red team from NSA and from a couple of other little spooky organizations got together and attacked the DoD. Part of it was on live networks, part of it was on closed networks, but at the end of this exercise, they recognized that the Defense Department was extremely vulnerable, that in fact they could break into just about any system they wanted to, that they could go from unclassified to classified and vice versa, that we in fact were very vulnerable. Well, shortly after that exercise concluded, a group of generals gathered in the Pentagon, in the tank. Everybody's familiar with this room. This is the one that's got the big long table with the spotlights, and the generals sit around. And they all looked at each other and said, "Is this for real?" And somebody says, "Yes, it is. We are very vulnerable." And a finger goes pointing around the room. Well, who's in charge of securing these computer networks? The generals all looked at each other. Well, is it probable that something will happen right now? Well, no, there was an exercise, there was some simulations, there was some artificiality, so after a while the meeting broke up and people went home. The same time, that fall, at the end of 1997, a commission under President Clinton released a report that says that we are vulnerable when it comes to critical infrastructures. The water sector, the power sector, transportation, energy, etc., all very critical, all lying there waiting for attack. But the report, really the conclusions of the report was we need to do something, but we really don't know what we need to do. Now fast forward a couple of months. It's now February of 1998. The Iraqis are violating another one of their treaties with the United Nations. The inspector teams can't go in. We decide to launch a couple of TLAMs on Baghdad. Well, we had some northern flight restrictions that were violated. So we're doing a kinetic attack against Iraq, we the United States, and about that same time, a couple of system administrators in an Air Force network starts to see interesting things happening on their networks. They call up some of their fellow system administrators around the Air Force, and they come to find out that these attacks are not localized, but in fact happening all across the Air Force. And in fact, it's also happening inside of NASA and inside of other federal government agencies. A cold chill goes down the back of the generals inside the Pentagon because they're remembering back to this eligible receiver exercise just a few months earlier that showed how easy it is to break into Defense Department networks. And now we have a kinetic war, a battle happening in Iraq. What on earth is going on underneath? As Dr. Rice said, that soft underbelly. Do we have an asymmetric attack now coming against the United States from a group of people who can't hit us kinetically, but they can certainly hit us where we really hurt? Again, the generals in the Pentagon gathered around a big long table. Finger goes around the room. Who's in charge? Nobody can figure out who's in charge. So at that point, they set forth, we need to do something about this. And wheels were set in motion for the Defense Department to build an organization. You can see the bottom bullet called the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense. That organization still exists today, and they've evolved. They're now called the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Operations because not only do they do the defensive side, but they're also authorized to do offensive work in cyberspace. Presidential Decision Directive 63 also came out in early 1998. This was a result of that commission from the previous year that says we really do need to get serious about critical infrastructures, and we need to recognize how we go about locking down the insecurities of the United States. Last thing I need to mention also in 1998 was the uncovering of a large intrusion into federal government, university, and private sector computers coming from a foreign country, not really breaking the law because everything they were obtaining was publicly available. It's just the way they were going about it. Rather than coming in through a front door, doing a normal web search or an FTP transfer, they were coming in through the back door, using well-known vulnerabilities against open ports, against well-known ways of breaking and entering, and installing little back doors and sniffing passwords and such. That investigation was finally closed by the FBI and never really came to much conclusion as to where it came from, unfortunately. PDD 63 laid down for the very first time this concept of sector liaisons. It said we need to line up federal government with different parts of the industry, and we also need to create new organizations. We'll talk about each of these briefly. But the critical infrastructures, we all know and love them now, the telecommunications, power, transportation. Intuitively, we recognize that there are these weaknesses and vulnerabilities. What we didn't realize at the time were the interdependencies. That in fact the transportation community depends on the energy community. That seems obvious. We need to use gas and oil to drive the trucks and the trains. But did we know also that the energy guys depend on, or say the electricity manufacturers depend on the oil producers, because it takes oil to run electricity, but it also takes electricity to run the refineries. And it takes those refineries to keep the transportation flowing. All interconnected. But at the bottom of all this was information technology. Computers and computer networks lying there vulnerable. Many known exploits that can allow nefarious individuals, groups, terrorists, host nations, whatever, to get into our critical infrastructures and cause damage. In 1998, the NIPC was established at the Department of Justice, unfortunately located in the FBI building. And the reason I say unfortunate is from the very start, it gave them a law enforcement tilt that has reduced their capability to be a little more open than they would like to. They've done a very good job over the years. They crank out some fairly good reporting and analysis, but the problem is it takes a long time. It takes a while for it to wash through the law enforcement systems to make sure they've reduced the reports down to where they contain nothing law enforcement sensitive. Other organizations are able to get out reports a lot quicker. The NIPC, along with 3 other groups, will merge into the Department of Homeland Security next spring if we can get the Homeland Security bill through the Senate. We'll talk Homeland Security in a few minutes. ISACs were also created under the PDD. Originally there was supposed to be only one, but the concept very quickly turned into we really need to have one for each sector. So now there's many ISACs. Some ISACs have been very, very successful. Others were a flash in the pan and have kind of died down. A recurring theme amongst many of the ISAC members is I have to pay to belong to the ISAC, and in a world of diminishing profits and investors not really wanting to invest into internet companies and telecommunications and other types of sectors, why should I keep paying into an ISAC when I'm looking at reducing employee strength and other types of factors? Some ISACs are free, some ISACs are to pay for. But all along, the federal government has kept its hands off the ISAC community. We wanted it to be just the industry. So that, for example, the FS ISAC, the financial services up in New York City, several banks, large banks, First Union, Citibank, et cetera, belong to the financial services ISAC. That they could share amongst themselves problems with the banks and the bank networks, intrusion information, and they know that that will all stay within the banking network. But if there's something that might apply to everybody, they can roll that up, strip off any proprietary information, give it to the NIPC. NIPC could compare that to what's coming in from transportation or energy, and could put together some type of analysis that shows what's going on with the networks across the sectors. But now we're getting many of the ISACs coming back to us and say, we appreciate the fact that the government is not inside of our ISAC, but we sure would appreciate some government dollars. So we're looking at the possibility, perhaps, of providing grant money to the ISAC so they can continue running even in a world where funding is getting cut back. The CHOW was also created in 1998, again another PDD 63 group, sits inside the Department of Commerce, and they do most of our outreach. They, along with the NIPC, will get rolled into Homeland Security next year. The neatest thing that CHOW has done so far is a project called Project Matrix. This is an analysis of all those critical sectors to find out exactly where the intersections are. Where do these networks overlap each other, as well as virtually and with people and with funding and all the different ways that things interact. It's the first time any nation has tried to do this. Other nations are looking at what we're doing and seeing if they, in fact, can also provide or use that same model to discover vulnerabilities in their critical infrastructures. Things that we're talking about, examples on the physical side, is as the telecom fiber optic circuits go east to west across the United States, as you can imagine, the Mississippi River goes north-south. There are very discrete locations where those cables cross the Mississippi River. As it turns out, if you investigate a little bit, there's just a handful of very key bridges. Lots of little smaller crossings, but on the order of less than 10 that are very key. And if you go further to the west, as we go through the Rocky Mountains, it even narrows down to just 3 or 4 very critical passes through which the fiber optic cabling connects West Coast to Middle America to East Coast. Knowledge of those locations will be very critical for somebody trying to do damage to the United States. It's knowledge of those types of things that we're finally putting together into a picture that says, well, how do we protect those locations that get very tight and very constricted? And what we're finding out, of course, is redundancy and alternate routing and other techniques will help mitigate that. But first we have to recognize the problem. Finally, the NIAC, which was established by the PDD but never really got off the ground, we're trying to give it a breath of fresh air. This is an advisory council for the President, that's going to help him understand the problems we have with information assurance and security of cyber infrastructures. We only appointed the new members of the NIAC just a few weeks ago. They're still going through the vetting process, filling out financial disclosure forms, et cetera, and we hope to get this group working and up and running within the next few weeks. So now move the clock up to just last year. All of us will remember where we were on September 11th. It's one of those days that will be anchored in our mind, and we have various emotional memories of it. I'm not going to go into a lot of the in-depth discussion, but let me focus in on a few things that we've learned, some lessons we've learned about our networks, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Take a look at Lower Manhattan. I'm going to use a laser pointer. I'll do it on both sides. This is the pad for the World Trade Center with Tower 1 and Tower 2, Tower 7. The objects I'm interested in are the Verizon building at 140 West Street and the New York Stock Exchange. And for those of you that are watching this side over here, we're talking about the World Trade Center here, the Verizon building, and the New York Stock Exchange. Notice how far away the Stock Exchange was from the World Trade Centers. So there's no physical damage to the to the exchanges, but when the towers came down, they caused such damage to the telecommunications sector that the financial markets were knocked off the air. Why did that happen? Well, this is an aerial view. Here we can see the remains of World Trade Center 1 and 2 and 7, and here's that Verizon building I was talking about. If everybody recalls, Tower 2 came down first, and it came down relatively vertical. When Tower 1 fell, several minutes later, maybe half hour later, the middle part came down vertical, but the top part tilted off to the side, and in fact, it landed up against Trade Center 7, which put Trade Center 7 on fire, a lot of significant damage there. I'll move over here to this side. And as World Trade Center 7 burned, it eventually fell, and when it fell up against the Verizon building. Steel parts, I-beams, etc., from inside World Trade Center 7, as it came down, began to pierce the ground. Same thing with Towers 1 and 2, causing a massive amount of damage underground as these large steel girders are piercing the concrete. Well, behind the Verizon building ran a large bundle of fiber optic cables. We're not talking single cables, you know, the little 1-inch size. It's got pairs inside of it, but a big bundle of these smaller cables. A steel I-beam went through the sidewalk several feet below it and literally pierced that entire bundle, severing it in half. And when that happened, that knocked off the stock markets and knocked off most telecommunications from downtown. As the firemen were putting the fires out, water, of course, is accumulating in the basements. It's flooding most of the cable conduiting. Plus, you have gas and oil pipelines that are cut. You've got steam pipes that were cut. An incredible amount of chaos underneath the streets of Lower Manhattan, as well as above ground where the towers fell. At the Verizon building itself, we can see the damage that was caused as World Trade Center 7 fell up against it, almost up to the 4th-story window. You can see that here, up against the 4th window. The building itself stood. The employees that were inside were fine, but the switching mechanisms inside suffered quite a bit of physical damage. If we take a look inside the building, we can see what happened inside one of the switching rooms as the exterior walls were pushed in, and again, bricks, I-beams, glass, all kind of damage that came into the building. One of the telephone switches, a 5ESS, was actually dangling from the window, an open window of the Verizon building, running on backup power. It has built-in batteries, only being held by the cable that connected it to the rest of the rack, but still switching phone calls, still working as it's hanging outside. Amazing resiliency, and it was just the tensile strength of the cable that's holding it in place. In fact, underneath the Pentagon, everybody remembers the pictures where the aircraft went into the Pentagon, a large portion of it fell down. In the basement, directly underneath the remains of the aircraft, was one of the 2 routers that connects the Pentagon to the rest of the world, a router rack. And in fact, the same thing happened there. When the power got cut, the cabling was still working, everything went on backup power, and some young soldier crawled through the mess with an orange extension cord and brought emergency power and plugged it up. And that router kept routing for several more days until they could get the debris off of it and actually get down to it. So we can really compliment people who build this equipment, who build extra pieces of security into it, things we never even think about, that the switches will continue to work and continue to work even when there's total chaos around it. After September 11th, the federal government created 2 new organizations, the Office of Homeland Security, which most people are familiar with, and my office, the President's Critical Infrastructure Protection Board, which many people, particularly in our world, have heard of, but the rest of the American public probably is not very familiar with. The roots of our organization predate September 11th. We had tried to do this back under the Clinton administration, to have an advisory group of senior officials from the rest of the offices, the rest of the departments, to help assist the President, the Vice President, in making critical decisions on infrastructure protection. It took the events of September 11th to actually get this group moving. So now we're a little bit over a year old. We were brought into existence on October 16th of last year, and we're up and running. We have the 26 members from the various organizations, and one of the things we were charged to do right out of the bat was to create this cyberspace security strategy, which I'll talk about in a minute. Well, no good government briefing is complete without a line chart. So here's where we sit. Part of us answer to the National Security Council, that's Dr. Rice's group. Part of us work with the Office of Homeland Security, that's Governor Ridge's organization, and of course that feeds up to the President. Below us are the various programs that work with the federal government and private industry. Our boss, Richard Clark, who is the chair of this board, also is the advisor to the President for cyberspace security, so you could imagine a dotted line that connects the board to the President. We operate on a public-private partnership. In other words, we don't want this just to be government, just a bunch of guys in suits sitting around trying to figure out ways to do cyberspace security. So we do an incredible amount of outreach to industry, organizations like yourself, where we try and make contact, get to know you, build that rapport so we can get your input into what we're doing. We also were told early on that we don't want to write any new laws, no new regulations. We don't need Congress out there writing laws about the Internet. We don't need the FCC regulating it like they do with the telcos and broadcast media. We would rather that the Internet just continue doing what it's doing, be this nice family of networks, and let the community drive the direction. But the federal government can still have a leadership role when it comes to purchasing power. As many of you know, we are probably one of the largest purchasers, single purchasers of software and hardware. So we do carry a good buying power. The Office of Management and Budget under Mark Foreman has taken enormous strides in the last couple of years to get a handle on federal spending, and starting in the 03 budget and really getting going in the 04 budget, we will see specific spending objectives, billions of dollars that will be spent over the next few years only on IT security. So we can really drive that market in terms of what we want. This is, again, where we need your help. If you feel that you're not having an influence on equipment manufacturers and where you want it to go, let us know. Because we're such a large buyer, we can push those manufacturers in the right direction. We can also push them in the wrong direction if we're being led that way. We also want to coordinate research efforts. We recognize that research into information security is probably the key thing that's going to develop the future generation of networks. And those networks have to have security built into them from the start. One of my favorite quotes out of DARPA, remember they came out of ARPA, the people who invented ARPANET, is that now that we've got the prototype working, of course they're referring to the Internet, let's start building the real thing. And it's very true, because 30 years of prototyping and experimenting, we've got something that works. Let's build a proper network now. Our priorities are many. Like any good government organization, we have many priorities, therefore we can't do one of them well. We're very spread out. But the very top one, this strategy, does tend to occupy most of our time. We've also looked into the results after September 11th, the fact that cell phones have no priority capability. Everybody understands how cell phones work. If I take my cell phone and open it up, dial a number, I'm going to stand in line behind everybody else who wants a channel on the local cell phone site. As long as all the channels or a significant number of channels are free, I immediately seize one and go forth. But what happens in a crisis like September 11th, where you have thousands of people trying to seize one of, say, 100 some odd channels? Everybody gets busy signals. On the wired side, there's always been programs for first responders, emergency personnel to make priority telephone calls, wired phone calls. So we work with the FCC to come up with ways that we can provision the wireless circuits to also provide priority. And there's an experiment going on now in both Washington and New York to the end of the year to see if, in fact, this works. And we're using part of the maintenance overhead of the cell systems. What we don't want to do is kick legitimate users off the system. In other words, people who are paying for cell phone service need to get the same level of service. But if you're an emergency responder, fire department, police department, utilities, others who are getting off of these private trunking systems and going to cellular technology, we need to have some way for them to do priority phone calls. One other thing I want to talk about real quick, which will affect hopefully many of you, is the Cyber Warning and Information Network. Let's bullet down here near the bottom. This is an effort to use federal tax dollars to put a private circuit into 75 different network operation centers around the nation. 15 of those will be government, the other 60 are private sector. These are the NOCs that run the Internet. The ones that we are interested in are the ones where we have good expertise and good individuals that want to share information. It's purely voluntary. When the team comes and knocks on the door and says, we would like to extend this circuit into your NOC for free, and the company that we're after kind of willy-nillys, and we're not sure if it won't do us any good, and humma, well, fine, we'll give it a college try, but if you're not interested, we'll just put you to the back of the line because there's plenty of companies that do. So if a group that's advertising CWIN is talking to your NOC and wants to put the CWIN suite there, please let them. What it will give us once it's finished is an out-of-band communication system that runs TCP/IP, just like the good old internet, but not connected to the internet and not connected to the public switch telephone network, the PSTN. This still relies on the SONET and ATM clouds like any other good telecommunication system does, but that's so nice and dispersed now, we can tunnel through it fairly easily. We are again using a maintenance overhead, provisioning that's always been there for the maintenance guys on the telephone side, but now we'll use it on the cyber side. What we'll do with it is coordinate responses. For example, last Monday night when we had the DNS problem, most of that coordination was just done by mailing lists, people sending email back and forth on the normal internet. Well, what if we had gotten to the point where the internet is unstable? If we have routes flapping and ASs that aren't talking to each other anymore, how do we then coordinate some type of fix unless we have an out-of-band system? So that's what we're after here. And again, there's no cost to the participating industries. One of the big goals, again, of our organization was to build this strategy, and there's many strategies that exist. The National Security Strategy was just published a few weeks ago. The Homeland Security Strategy has been out since last summer. There are other strategies that are periodically published by the federal government, but the one we're interested in is this one for securing cyberspace. I put it at the top of the chart, not because it's the most important, but because it is the most important. It's something that we need to be keen to, and it crosses over from both national security to Homeland Security, plus a little bit that's outside of that world. It's not really a how-to guide, although many wanted us to do that, have a step-by-step instruction, but what we want it to be ultimately is some type of roadmap, somewhere that we can get our nation on the road, on the direction of doing cyberspace security and doing it properly. We want it to be part of the Homeland Security, and we want it to be living. We also don't want it to be written by a bunch of government bureaucrats. We really, really, really do want your input. So what's happened now is the draft was published on September 18th. It's out for comment for 60 days. Please, if you haven't already done so, download a copy of the draft document, read through it, and be very critical. Give us some feedback. Tell us what parts you like. Tell us what parts you don't like. Rearrange it if you need to. I'm going to walk through how the strategy looks in just a moment. So this is your opportunity to help us as a nation put together a proper strategy. We had wanted to actually issue version 1 with the President's signature on September 18th, but it turned out that the guys across the street over in the West Wing, the lawyers looked at it and said it's too big, there's too much details, the President can't sign something like this, we need to make it a little more presidential, it's too much in the weeds. We said, okay, fine, we'll go back to the drawing board, but would you let us at least release it for public comment? They said we can do that. So we have this really neat 60-day window that you can participate in getting this thing looking like you want it to. What we may wind up with is a very short strategy, much like national security or Homeland Security, maybe less than 10 pages that the President will sign, but then we have some type of implementation plan or implementing guidelines that'll be put together by industry, put together by academia, put together by others that practice this art, that can lead us forward with how to implement a very small strategy. Again, we welcome your comments on how to do that. If you'd like to download a copy, go to cybersecurity.gov. That will automatically link you to a location on the White House website. You'll see both a PDF version and an HTML version. You pick whichever one you like. There's also a link there for giving feedback. The strategy itself starts off with building a case for an action, and then it goes through these 5 levels. And it's important to understand why we have 5 levels. First off, we address what's probably the most common user out there. That's these home individual dial-up users, as well as those who have cable DSL connection, high-speed, and the growing phenomenon now of building home networks. I'm sure all of us have home networks. That's something we all like to do. But I've noticed that my neighbors to my left and to my right are also building home networks. Find out they've got a couple of computers. They've got the older one they've given to their teenager. They've got the new one that mom and dad like to surf on. They both want to share the broadband connection, so they run down to Radio Shack. They buy the little plug-and-play devices that let them hook their network up through the phone system, and next thing you know, they have a home network. And then their kid goes off to college, comes back with a notebook computer. They want to connect it up, and these home networks are actually starting to become a phenomenon, much like a 2-car family or a two-color TV family, or these other technology things we've seen in the past. So recognizing that the home users are very much like small businesses, for example, a doctor's office, a lawyer's office, somebody that has maybe 10 or 11 employees in a small network, the couple of things that makes them in common is that, number one, they don't have an IT shop, except the home user, their 17-year-old might be the IT manager. That keeps them out of trouble. Plus, they don't have a security operation. The best that they know how to do is to keep their antivirus software updated if they're running antivirus software. That's another big if. So we address them as a special group, and we also recognize that probably represents the most that are out there. And then we go our way on up through the hierarchy. And we'll talk about each of these. But first, the case for why we're doing this is, as I've talked about earlier, we are dependent on cyberspace. This is our essence now. This is what makes America America. It's what making other countries what they are. Japan, Germany, France, England, all around the world, Australia, countries are on board with cyberspace. They're wiring, they're wirelessing, they're bringing connections to people. We have to recognize this phenomenon is not just a flash in the pan. It's the way we're going to do business for the next hundreds, if not thousands of years. We've got to get it right now. We can't continue to imagine that this is just some little game. We have to build a good baseline. We have threats that come from all types of directions, from the little script kiddies all the way up to nations who are attacking nations, terrorists, businesses who do competitive intelligence gathering. But the one thing we know for sure is that the threats, while there are many, are very unpredictable. We did a very poor job of predicting September 11th last year. We will probably continue to do a very poor job, we the federal government, of predicting where threats will come from. But we do know all about vulnerabilities. I think every one of you know where your networks and your systems and your hosts are vulnerable. From people vulnerabilities to unpatched systems to open ports to configurations, whatever it might be, take the time now to fix those vulnerabilities before the next attack comes. Don't orient on what the threat is or who might attack you next, but orient on where you're vulnerable and close those vulnerabilities. Shorten your exposure so that when an attack does come, it hits you very lightly and hopefully your neighbors as well. We're also making a fairly bold statement here at the bottom. This is one of the rare times the federal government will stand up and say, this is not something we can do by ourselves. There is no way that the federal government, the U.S. federal government, will be able to secure cyberspace. I don't think you want us doing it, because cyberspace doesn't belong to the federal government. It belongs to the people who are in it, the citizens of the networks. It's up to each of us as individuals to secure our little corner of cyberspace, not wait on some large monster federal organization to do it. Now, this really upsets people, particularly in the federal government, who would like to think that we're always the safety net. That the general public, when they have problems, when things fail, they can always just fall backwards and the government will catch them and everything will be okay. That's the foundation of things like Social Security and the other programs that we have. But securing cyberspace is different. It's so vast, it's so complex. We don't have the people that can understand this to the level that you do. Plus, we don't have the regulations and the laws to make this happen. Matter of fact, we don't want them. So if the government were to secure cyberspace, that means the government would have to regulate cyberspace and the government would have to issue laws for cyberspace, almost like having driver's licenses and safety programs like seat belts and all the other things we do with other infrastructures. I don't think we want to go there. And to keep us from making that happen means that each of us have to do a very good job of securing the part that we own. Now, we talked about small users. Again, the big focus here is almost what we would call common sense efforts. Using firewalls if you're on a high-speed connection of some sort, antivirus software, updated software. And something very interesting, we haven't seen this before in a government document, but a discussion of spam problems and the fact that so much trash now is coming into our networks from spammers that users have a very hard time filtering what's real email versus what's spam email. They wind up deleting things they shouldn't be deleting. They wind up reading things they shouldn't be reading. And it makes it very easy to do virus and worm delivery because poor little Johnny and Jane in their house are getting so much garbage on the internet, it's hard to filter out. So we ask the ISPs, those big ones who run mail services, to please work together and develop ways to do anti-spamming and to get a little more control over this cancer almost that's affecting the internet. We also would like ISPs together to collaborate on ways that we can do patch dissemination, the way we can do updates, figure out some way that we can push that down to our customers. For large enterprises, those that already have IT shops, security shops, what we're looking at there is a change in focus of responsibility. instead of saying that the system administrator down in the basement is responsible for internet security, why don't we bring it up to the corporate level, make it a responsibility of the board of directors, just like they're responsible for risk analysis, for financial management, for dealing with competitors and competition and customers. Make that board also responsible for the cyber health of that organization. Form some type of security councils, do independent audits, bring that information up to a higher level. And down at the bottom, reward those who are doing the right thing. Have company contests, give away t-shirts, ball caps, whatever it takes to raise that awareness of cyberspace security throughout the organization. We also make just a little pitch for those companies that are mainframe based, and many still are, particularly when it comes to payrolls and personnel systems. Don't forget about your mainframes. A lot of security today is oriented on the nice lightweight computers, the ones that run local area networks and such, but that old iron still has known vulnerabilities. Level 3 goes into many of the critical sectors. I wanted to talk about one here, the federal government. If you look at the strategy, you'll see there's a focus on education, there's the state and local governments, there's also the different sectors of the economy that we talked about earlier, transportation, energy, etc. But what we would like the government to do, this is our own people, first off is to look at NIAP, that Infrastructure Assurance Partnership. That's the melding between the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the NSA that certifies products for government use. We like that approach. We really do want to have certified products, but we're recognizing that the NIAP process is very expensive and takes a long time. And it's a hindrance for people who are advocates of the open source world, who would like to get open source products, say Apache, etc., through the NIAP process. Who's going to pay for it? Who belongs to it? I'm going to show you a statistical chart here at the end that shows you how much the government actually does use open source, whether we like to admit it or not. We'd also like to do certification and building our own assessment tools and our own continuity of operations. A lot of what you see here is leadership. It's taking the federal government and treating it as an enterprise, just like a corporate America, and saying we can do things within the federal government just like we want everybody else to do. Quit falling back and saying it can't be done, it's impossible, it's money, it's people, and kind of hike up our pants and take a little bit of a leadership role. We are making some headway there, but we're still up against some of the older mindsets that would like to keep it dispersed. Our national priorities kick it up above the companies and economies, and we're looking at what can we do as a nation. And this probably is a section that I would like each of you to take as strong a look at as you possibly can. Tell us if we're on track here. Tell us if these are worthwhile ideas. And if you have any other ideas that are available, please give them to us. But we're looking at how, as a nation, do we move forward with these new protocols? Is it proper to keep ourselves bound in protocols that are 15, 20, 30 years old and use that as a foundation of a network that has to last the next 1,000 years? Or is it time for us to look at new protocols, new ways of doing business, new things like SPGP and DNSSEC, etc.? Or are those protocols also flawed? Are there even more future ones that are more redundant, more scalable? Particularly if we move to IPv6 in the next few years and we get a network with 10 to the 38th possible IP addresses or discrete locations. Do these routing networks scale? Do the naming or the routing protocols, do the naming protocols scale? Do the mail protocols scale? All those questions we need to ask. Can we get codes of conduct developed amongst the ISPs, both government side and industry, working together to figure out what's the right way to move? SCADA systems are those networks that glue together many of the critical infrastructures. That's like the little valves on water treatment plants that adjust what direction the water flows in or how much water flows over a dam, or the measuring systems on transmission lines that load balances the power. Typically, those were never connected to a public network because they were running protocols that just wouldn't work on public networks. But now many of these utilities are looking at the internet as a cheaper way of transporting that information, and they're developing SCADA systems that are internet compliant, and they're moving much of this over to the internet as a transport mechanism. Well, hopefully that makes the hair on the back of your neck crawl, because we all know how insecure the internet is, and we don't want some little kid poking around inside the water supply system here in Eugene and mixing the bad stuff with the good stuff because he thinks it's a lot of fun. And oh, by the way, that kid lives in Salt Lake City or over in New York City or maybe even another country. So we're addressing that very hard. How do you improve the security of those SCADA systems? And there's a few more points on there. Finally, at the very top level, global. We would like very much for other nations, and many are already doing this. We want to get this global feeling of network security. We would like to have warning and watch centers pretty much in every country. We'd like to all have them talking to each other. We'd like to have a common language, and I don't mean English. I'm talking about a language where we can communicate the ideas, the alerts, the analysis. If I talk about an intrusion in France, does a French administrator and analyst think the same thing as a gentleman in Japan who also sees an intrusion, or a lady in Japan? Can they communicate using some type of communication, some type of language that's common? We really want to see that happen. We recognize, again, it's that sharing of information, not only amongst ourselves but amongst other countries, that will make this thing work. Council of Europe came up with a very interesting convention on cybercrime, talking about how we actually address crime in cyberspace. We're encouraging other countries to adopt this, either adopt the principles directly out or something similar to that. Make that a part of what your country looks like. And of course, here in the United States, Mexico and Canada being our north and south partners, we're working with those governments to ensure that cross-border communication systems as well as other infrastructures are in fact secure. This culture of, or global culture of security is what we're pushing very hard for. Just this weekend, concluding today, the APEC leaders were together in Mexico City, and in fact they have now gotten all the leaders of the APEC countries to agree to a strategy for security, which includes terrorism, not just cyberspace. But it's really interesting is that there's 3 bullets that have come out of this that all the APEC countries will agree to do before this time next year, and in particular the enactment of cyber laws and the establishments of certs in every APEC country. A very amazing thing that they've agreed to that, and they've recognized from the leaders level that this is important. Now, how do you, as a network operator, fit into this big picture? What are the things that you can do to help us? Well, we all know that the internet was created as a way of just connecting people together. We knew that we had computers back in the 60s that could talk, but we didn't really think in terms of connecting more than just point to point until the end of the 60s when the ARPANET came together. And we found that we could, in fact, start creating a network gluing computers together. And, of course, Aloha Net out in Hawaii was building. There was TimeNet and other these little islands of networks. And then the thought said, why can't we connect all the networks together? Sure, build a network of networks. That became known as the Internet. But at the time, the idea was information exchange. How do I get my computer to talk to your computer? And it was all done very academically, very open. Nobody was really thinking about security because the people who worked in that world were all supposed to be friends with each other. This attack mindset that we have today was not part of the thinking of the people back in the 60s and early 70s. Unfortunately, that's the way we are today. Most of the protocols are open, but for those of us who've built the networks over the years, is it our responsibility to secure it? I mean, we birthed the baby. Shouldn't we be taking care of the baby? Or are we going to be one of these fathers that just runs away and leaves mama and the kid? What level of responsibility falls upon those who are actually who built the old networks and who are building the new networks to adopt security as part of one of your fundamental ways of doing business? What is your role? Well, let's think about this for a second. If I want to build a secure internet, these are future networks now because we want to build future secure networks, and we have to go back and just do the best we can with the old stuff. I'm not going to advocate IPv6 necessarily because I realize it's a religious war, but we do have to have some type of accountable addressing. One of the clear things for security is recognizing who's out there and what's out there and who exactly is talking to who. Knowing, of course, we still have anonymity and privacy and other concerns we need to take care of. We have to have network services that can trust each other. BGP peers that can really, no kidding, trust each other, that in fact they are who they say they are, and they're not being poisoned and infiltrated with bogus routes and with hosts that are forging addresses and all the neat things that we see going on out there. We need user service that are authenticated, so that if I send you an email, you know it really is coming from me and not somebody masquerading as me. Of course, the key to making some of these work is some type of public key infrastructure, a PKI, that in fact actually works. PKI we know is a good idea, but we haven't seen it scale to the point where it can actually become embedded in the systems. We also need security built into networks from the ground up, not added on as an afterthought. We need best practices. We need clueless users to be taken care of, to protect ourselves from them and to protect themselves from each other. That means thinking of ways, thinking ahead of your users that do silly things, even people in your own organizations that do unpredictable things. How do we stay ahead of that power curve? How do we build security into our networks? Finally, we also need to think of how we do information sharing and the certification of network engineers. This is a concept we all know about, the various CISSPs and MCSPs, all those neat little titles we put after our names. But can we get down to certifying companies? Can we certify products? Can we actually, if a company comes in and says, I am internetsecurity.com and I'm here to help you, how do we know that they really are certified to do what I am going to pay them to do? How do we do our due diligence? We also have to define what security is. I mean, there's some old classic concepts of security, protection of authenticity, integrity, confidentiality, protecting against unauthorized disclosure. I mean, those are classic. Those are NSA-type terms. But what is security really? Do we need a new definition of it? Can we really get into the weeds? One of the most novel ones I've heard so far states that security is really the knowledge of everything that goes on around you, and it's creating a world of known states. For those of you that have strong computer science degrees, it's like running a state machine. You know, this theoretical thing that says if I'm in state 0, state 1, state 2, and I can predict where something's going to go. But if I go into an unknown state, I've now become insecure. So how do I create known states, and how do I operate within that known state? And there is a lot of academic work being done on defining that, because what it boils down to is how do you measure security? How do you know if you really are secure? Can you be sort of secure, or is it black and white? You either are secure or you aren't. Big questions. We need to have answers to those. What about open source? Is it secure? That's a religious war. The government position on this more is, can we get it certified? And again, like I talked about earlier, we're working with NIAP to see if we can kind of change the process a little bit so more open source products can go through the NIAP process. That's what we're interested in, is can we certify it as being secure versus is it open source or proprietary? Your mileage may vary on this. You'll have to come up with your own agreement on it. The NIAP itself, of course, just to briefly touch on it, is an organization that's put together to evaluate these tools, evaluate things for the federal government and for other governments and for industry. If you want to be a NIAP partner, that's okay. You can do that. It's not just the federal government. But one of the neat things about the NIAP, if you go and look at how they do their program, they use open source tools to do their analysis. So they're not using a proprietary tool. So it comes down to, are we serious about it or are we aren't? This is kind of an interesting chart here, and I'm coming down to the last couple of slides. I wanted you to see that inside the federal government, the .govs and the .mil networks, look at the types of web servers we use and the numbers. That in fact Apache ranks at the top for government networks, over a third running Apache, and in the military networks, almost a fourth of the military networks running Apache. And those numbers, they're a little dated. That was February and May. This is taken from Netcraft. Once the Netcraft does their next cycle, I think what you're going to see is an even larger increase of Apache and a lowering of IIS as more people get on board with the Apache software. So, interesting set of numbers here. So where do we go with all this? How do we wrap it all up? Again, security starts with the individual. It starts with companies and corporations and small networks, and then starts building on itself. It's something that we need. It's a culture we need to build, a mindset. It's almost like what we've done with kids, where we've done safe sex programs in high schools and junior high. Why don't we have safe hex in junior high and college? Why don't we teach it? Why don't we take third graders and when they very first get exposed to the network, show them where the good and the bad is? Junior high school kids, show them where it is. Senior high school, kids that are 15, 16, 17 that love to play on the networks. I've got 2 daughters that are teenagers. I've taken enormous pains to show them where the nasty stuff is on the internet, so they don't have to go there and see it by themselves. I show them where it is. And then also on my firewall, I log it. How many parents out there log where your kids go on the internet and then show your kids that you know where they go? How many parents go in and check to see if the kids are routinely deleting their history files because they're trying to cover something up from their parents, but they forget to go in and delete the cookies, which is just another wonderful little history trace where you can see where they've been on the internet. I know most parents don't do that because most parents think, okay, Johnny and Susie, they're down in the basement, they're surfing the internet, they're at discovery.com, they're downloading neat stuff for their homework assignments, they're causing no trouble. Not like the kid across the street who's out there running his old car up and down and he's selling drugs and causing all kind of problem in and out of jail. My kid's in the basement, not causing a bit of problems. But what are we doing to educate those children? What happens when somebody knocks on the door and shows an FBI badge and says, ma'am, I need to talk to you about your computer usage, and come to find out that Johnny wasn't on discovery.com. He's running an IRC server, and he's got 15 little bots that are out collecting information, and he's DDoSing root server DNSs, or God knows what Johnny's up to. Parents don't understand that. It's up to us to instill that culture, to get it out, to build this future of network security. So ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, what all can you do? Think about it yourself. What can you as an individual do to contribute to this culture of cybersecurity? How can you run your networks? If you've got any thoughts, send them to us. Let us know. Again, go to that Cyberspace security site, download the strategy, give us our comments, tell us what we can do to help. I think I'm pretty close. Yeah, we're pretty close to a break here. I'll be more than happy to wait outside or wait up here if you've got individual questions. Is that time for a question or two? Okay. So we'll open it up. Do you have Mr. Microphone you can pass around? There are microphones out there. So at this point, recognizing that we're all up against a break, and we don't want to take away from break time, we will take at least 2 questions maybe.
I think we have a little time. Is this on? When you come up to the mics, do tell us who you are. I mean, I always say that.
So, also with a question, my name's Matt Petak from Microsoft. Early on in one of your slides, you mentioned that the Joint Task Force was originally labeled for defense, and now it's for operations because you can do offensive as well as defensive.
Right.
What kind of offensive...
Does that inspire you?
Well, I'm a little curious. What kind of offensive stuff are they looking at doing, and should we as network operators be worried about this?
Is my wireless still on back in the back? Yeah, okay, you can still hear me. Yeah, I would be very worried. But the part I would be worried about is the experience level. Do they understand what they're doing? Because the computer networks don't belong to the DoD. I mean, the ones that they operate in, absolutely. But they're all interconnected with private networks. The Air Force, for example, their networks don't extend into Iraq or into some other country. So what we have to make sure then is to keep a very close eye on what's going on, that in fact what happens is correct. But on the other hand, other nations have cyber offensive capabilities. Our nation has it as well. It's been behind what we call the green door for many years, the very dark, deeply buried capabilities. Just now coming out. If you do a Google search on network attack, you'll find an incredible wealth of information that's coming out. I can say that these are very well-trained individuals. It's a very small group. They are doing what is proper. What's keeping them from really excelling is the U.S. Constitution, which is probably a good thing, and laws that keep them within their bounds. But it is a capability that we as a nation have to have in order to defend ourselves against other nations that would try and take advantage of our open networks. Yes, sir.
I'm Steve Sullivan from AT&T.
Hi, Steve.
Most computer security problems, most network security problems are due to bugs in the code, and all the network protocols in the world are not going to stop that. There's nothing anyone in this room can do. I can wave my magic wand and secure all the protocols and all the networks. It's not going to do a thing for the buggy software, which is most of the problem. What does the administration have in mind for that?
What can we do about buggy software? Well, what we don't want to do is pass some type of law that says it's illegal to write buggy software.
I can go along with that one, yeah.
If you want us to, we can certainly introduce the bill, but I don't think that's where we want to go. What it's going to take is not the administration, but some company, some group of people that are willing to actually try a lawsuit. I don't think right now against the software companies per se, because many have these license agreements. If you read way down at the bottom, it says, by running my software, I hereby absolve myself of any problems. Part of that, of course, is due to the complexity of the software. There are things that people will do with software that were never thought of by the software developers. But I think the true answer to it is not today, but down the road. How do we get the education level? For example, in the civil engineering world, if a bridge falls down, we take a very strong look at why the bridge fell down. We go back and we rewrite the engineering books on concrete, on steel, etc., learning from those lessons. Are we doing the same thing for software engineers? When we teach software writing, when kids are learning back in the fundamental years in high school, etc., are we teaching them how to do proper code? Do we have an apprenticeship type program? Or are we just hiring anybody who can sing a little bit of Perl and make a web programmer out of them, and eventually they grow up with bad skills? These are the kind of questions we have to ask ourselves fundamentally for the long term, and it's not really something the administration can do anything about, but it's more of a cultural problem that we all have to fix for the future of software writing.
Thank you. It's a good lead-in. I mentioned there's a program at Seton Hall Law School next month, and I was speaking on law and software vulnerabilities. So,
Seton Hall?
Seton Hall, S-E-T-O-N, law.shu.edu.
Law.shu.
And I tried to actually make it a moot court, trying some major software vendor for a particularly egregious bug. The lawyers decided not to go along with that one.
But it'd be interesting to try it and see. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Sean Donald. One question I have is how to perhaps improve the communications with the government. One of the issues I've noticed is that there are a whole lot of people who want to help us, and every time we go to Washington, D.C., we end up having meetings with Department of Commerce, FCC, White House, Department of Energy, and somehow they can't manage to schedule all their meetings, so we only have to go to Washington, D.C. once. They schedule them here and there, and you don't actually find out about them until 2 days before and things like that. So is there any way that perhaps government could coordinate with itself a little better, so us that don't actually live in the Eastern time zone don't have to fly to Washington, D.C. 2 or 3 times a week just to meet with all the people who want to help us?
Yeah, I wish there was a very good answer for what you're saying. Unfortunately, the government is not monolithic. We're not, this big pyramid with the president at the top, and we can issue directions down. We are almost like several companies that are all kind of working with each other and competing in this government space. We're trying very hard because we recognize not just the meeting piece of it, but even for companies who want to get in and sell or compete or do things with the government, it's very hard because there's so many entry doors, there's so many people you have to talk to. This is why many companies maintain offices right there in Washington, have employees that do that dirty deed. But I think what we're going to be up against is because government is so large, and we're talking several million employees, trying to get everybody on our side in one place at one time may be a bridge too far. We recognize there's a problem. One of the things that we're working with through the CHOW is to try and solve what you're saying, to at least get the key leaders, to find out who the people are that we need to do the outreach with and make them available at appropriate times. Now, we can't do this, of course, daily. It may wind up being some forum that we can do our best with. But I know in our office, if we have a group coming in to see us, we will try very hard to invite others from other offices to come in at the same time to prevent, like what you're saying, repeat visits to Washington. Other than that, I would encourage you, if you do set up a session with an organization in D.C., that you ask them to invite others, or if you know who the right people are, to get them there at the same time if possible. There's no good answer, no concrete way we're going to solve this, except for just recognizing the fact that there is a problem. But I wish I had a better answer for you. Thanks. Let me take one more question, and I think we're going to have to go for the break. Yes, sir.
Stephen Stewart. I was one of the lucky recipients of Monday's alleged attack on the name servers, and I'm going to grandstand here for a moment and use...
Can you tell us which server is yours, or you want to keep that private?
Oh, I think everyone knows.
Okay.
Source address verification would be nice to reduce the anonymity of these attacks. Even if you can't do it for all of your infrastructure, it would be nice if you could do it for the part that you can, in order to make the part that you can't do source address verification for stand out a little better. It's very difficult to be on the receiving end of one of these things with packets appearing to come in from all over the place, and not have any idea how the source address really matches up to providers. And so if you could possibly integrate that into your thinking and advocate source address verification, that would be nice.
Thank you. I believe in the strategy, I'll have to find the quote, we are looking at egress filtering as being one of the key things we can do, and I believe that's hitting right on what you're talking about. Unfortunately, there's a lot of resistance, particularly from the larger carriers, to egress filtering for technical reasons, but that does not take away from the local guys, your local premise or edge router, to do egress filtering as close to the client as possible. That goes back to just good hygiene on the internet.
Do you have time for one more quick?
Really not. I'm sorry. We do need to stop. We're running late.
Come find me on the break.
Let's start again promptly at 20 for Vern's talk. Thank you.